exclusive interview of the day. My colleague Rituparna Bhuyan now joins us with a very special guest, Andre Kostin, President and Chairman of VTB Bank. Rituparna, over to you.
Hello and welcome to this special segment in CNBC TV 18. Russian President Vladimir Putin is in Delhi for a bilateral visit, and accompanying him is a large business delegation. One of the important delegates in that delegation is Andre Kostin, who is the Chairman and Managing Director of VTB Bank, one of the largest banks in Russia, who will talk to us about the B2B relationship between both the countries. Thank you so much for joining us. Let's start by talking about the announcement that you made today, a $150 million credit that you have announced for West Bengal-based petrochemical company Matex. Will VTB Bank be looking at more such financing for Indian companies?
Yes, of course. We have quite a good experience of financing Indian companies, and we are now working with a number of leading industrial groups in order to see their demand for lending and for borrowing money, and we are very much interested, and also providing advice on international transactions, on transactions within India as an investment bank. So yes, I mean, India is a very fast-growing economy, and of course we can't miss it.
Right. So what are sectors will you be looking at as far as financing projects in India are concerned?
Well, all the major, we've been working with the oil refinery sector when we helped to strike a deal between Rosneft and its partners and Essar Oil. We also are interested in steel production, in energy sector, in port construction, and in petrochemical, fertilizers, and others. Infrastructure is very important.
Right.
I think Russian companies are very much interested, like Russian railways are very much interested in being on this market, and we'll be very happy to assist them.
Right. So I'll come back to the B2B relationship, but before that, I wanted to ask you about a specific interest that you have in India, that is through a new metal. And there is an interest in Essar Steel, which New Metal has expressed. It wants to bid for that company, and VTB Bank is a major stakeholder in New Metal. Now, yesterday, the Supreme Court has made it abundantly clear through an order that the only manner in which New Metal could successfully present a resolution plan for Essar Steel would be to first pay off the debts of Essar Steel as well as those of the Rupee group of companies. So my question to you is, will New Metal be willing and be able to first pay off the debts and then come to the starting line to bid for Essar Steel?
No, it's too early to say, because as you quite correctly pointed out, the Supreme Court order came only yesterday afternoon. So our lawyers now studying very thoroughly all the details of this order. And the good news about us, that in spite the fact that there was many comments and fake news about VTB here, Supreme Court recognized VTB as a good bidder, as a viable good bidder, and that's good news for us. And of course, under the circumstances of what the Supreme Court ruled out, we should now consider what our next step, what our strategy should be. We are very much committed, of course, to this transaction, but we'll have to see, because every transaction has its own price.
So it's a wait and watch mode, because if you take this forward, Essar Steel alone has a debt of around 45,000 crores, and this has to be settled according to Supreme Court in the next 2 weeks. That's quite a daunting task, I must say.
Within these 2 weeks, we'll make a decision, and it will be announced, of course.
So you are willing to take this risk?
I can't say, because it's not my personal decision. That should be board decision. So we shall see. As I said, as soon as we get a report from our lawyers, we will then discuss it at the board meeting.
Right. There are also other issues which were raised in this order. Firstly, as you had mentioned, Supreme Court maintains that VTB Bank remains good as far as bidding for Essar Steel is concerned. Whatever happened in Europe doesn't matter. VTB Bank can take forward any other interest here in India. But it has also maintained that, as far as, the presence of individuals like Revant Ruia is concerned, there is a looming presence of a person like Revant Ruia right from the incorporation of New Metal to the time when the second bid was submitted. So what do you have to say about such observations?
Well, the Supreme Court took the decision,
right,
and everybody should respect it.
Right.
So within, according to this order, we should see what our next step would be. It's too early for me to make comments on this.
So by when do we see? Because as I said, 2 weeks is...
2 weeks is enough to make a decision, because we are very much involved in the transaction. We know all the details, and we'll come up with some ideas. I can't say absolutely at the moment what decision would.
So it could be a yes or a no, depending upon the advice that you get from a lawyer.
Not only lawyers, but it's also, as I said, as a board. And there will be pro and cons of this, but we will consider this.
Right. What was more interesting? What explains the interest of the VTB Bank in a sector like steel, and that too in a distressed asset? Can you just explain?
Banks are dealing with distressed assets, and basically we believe that Essar Steel is a very good company. It's one of the leading steel producer in India, and India does need steel because of the growth. So basically, I think there's a certain mistakes and maybe too much debt, but basically the company is healthy and good. And I think that would be good if the matter would be resolved. The sooner the better for the company. So definitely that's the main interest, because as you said, the company basically is good, and it's just maybe the certain level of mismanagement, too much debt. But if this question is resolved, I'm quite sure that will be one of the leading industrial producer or metal producer in India, not only in India, maybe in the world.
Right. So as you are saying that you see Essar Steel as a good company to invest in and take it forward. Then are you willing to then take other routes also to then explore? Having a stake in picking up or bidding for Essar Steel, for example, through other companies. Like as of now, we are doing it with new metal. Other companies are also interested. Will you be willing to partner with them as well?
We are open for any possibilities now, but it's too early for me to make any specific comments, because we'll be studying, we'll be working on this over the weekend and then the beginning of next week.
What about other distressed assets? You said there are good companies in India, but there were financial mismanagement. Many of them are distressed. Will a bank like VTB be also interested in participating in other distressed?
We did participate already. We did participate already in, for example, buying with discount some loans to some companies. I think that there's many enterprises in India which has a very high debt, but and that's why they're distressed. But if we clear up these things, I'm quite sure that that will be a very good company. So yes, I mean, we're interested. We know situation in Indian banking sector is not easy. There's a lot of NPLs, and yes, we're trying to help and to see. We have some experience of distressed assets in Russia. In Russia, we had, during the crisis of 2007, 2009, we were dealing with a lot of distressed assets. So we're trying to implement our use and our knowledge on this in trying to work in India as well.
Right. Okay, let's change gear here now and let's talk about India-Russia B2B relations. Now, given the kind of geopolitical situation that we are in, there are sanctions, etc., any B2B relation between India and Russia will have to be backed up by payment mechanism. We had the Rupee-Rouble arrangement before. Do you think such an arrangement will have to be needed if Indian and Russian companies, they decide to trade?
Yes, but I also should say that sometimes the Indian banks are too much cautious, I would say, without any good reason. Because if we take sanctions today, which applies to leading Russian banks, they touch only two areas that American investors are not allowed to buy new stocks, and they are not allowed to lend money to VTB, for example, for more than 2 weeks. All other transactions, all the payments, completely allowed. Of course, unless we're talking about some SDN enterprises from Russia or from other parts of the world. So unfortunately, not always the banks understand it. They are trying to be on the safe side, not to do rather than do. And they are losing this even competition with American banks, for example, which is doing much more transactions, actually, and not afraid.
So American banks are doing transactions with Russian entities?
Yes, of course, of course.
And the same model can be...
Of course. Every day we have thousands and thousands of transactions in dollars through American banks, of course. Sanctions are not covering this area at all. So that's why sometimes the Indian banks don't understand, but it's quite easy for them. You know, if they have business in America, they can contact American Treasury or FAC and check it, but somehow they don't do it sometimes, and that's not very good. I wish something I don't quite understand sometimes.
So was this raised during the bilateral talks, and have you raised it with the Indian government as well?
Yes, of course. But of course, each bank has its own policy, but that's a fact of life. But of course, we will talk about some areas, as you mentioned, maybe which is covered by American sanctions, as a not banking sector, but some others. Then we should really think about this. But and as you quite correctly pointed out, I think the settlement in local currencies like rupees and rubles, they are the good solution for this.
So both a Rupee-Rouble arrangement and a normal arrangement, both can be worked out depending upon the sector in which they are.
Depending upon the sector, I think, and the Russian banks at least are quite ready to trade in rubles and in rupees. That's for sure. Though, of course, the more trade we have between our two countries, the better. As you know, two leaders, Mr. Modi and Mr. Putin, set a target to increase by the year 2025 our bilateral trade from $10–11 billion now to 30, and I think it's quite feasible, it's quite possible, and that would be good, because the more trade we have, the more local currency we need, you know, and then it will be easy for such transactions.
So joint hedging mechanism for a Rupee-Ruble kind of arrangement will have to be worked out?
We're not saying, yes, I mean, there's already was quite a good relationship and agreement between the central banks on this. They provide support for this. But, you know, we're not talking about removing dollar from our trade. Of course, that's nonsense. Dollars, euros, all other currency will be used. But we should develop the mechanism of trading in our own currencies and take part of the transaction in our own currencies. That's what I think both sides now support. And I think if we focus on this, we'll achieve quite a good results within the next couple of years, probably.
Yeah. Since you're a banker, let me just try to understand from you one of the biggest transactions that's going to happen between India and Russia, and that's in the defense space. Today, we have announced the S-400 missile deal, the Triumph missile deal. In such a case of defense trade, when does payments happen? Do they start immediately, or does it start when the supplies happen? Because in the case of S-400, for example, the deliveries will start in a couple of years.
I don't know. That's not my area of activity.
The reason I was asking you is because of CATSA.
No, not yet. But as they sign it today, I think they will later approach leading Russian banks, maybe to see the mechanism of payment and settlement, but not now. I mean, we will know very little about this transaction at the moment. It was just announced.
Right.
So we'll be looking at this when we ask.
Right. You know, defense and energy are the two primary areas in which India and Russia engage in. But do you see possibility of expanding this, and if so, in what areas?
Yes. I mean, for example, there's a couple of agreements which were signed today. One is about the possibility of Russian railways, with the help of Russian Direct Investment Fund, to invest in a railway. In India, of course, India, like Russia, has a big territory and big requirements for trains and carriers and this kind of thing. And Russia is a good producer of all this equipment and quite good in logistics. So I mean, we're very much interested in this. So transport infrastructure is very high on the agenda. There also was some agreement signed with the Russian fertilizer producers. And also, you know, India, of course, produces its own, but it also requires a lot, buying a lot because of the large agricultural sector. So that's another area, for example, fertilizer industry and high technology. I mean, the Indians are very good in IT, and Russia, I think, also has quite a lot of talents. And I think there's a discussions or already agreement on having some startups in this area and join our efforts in IT to create new technological products.
Right. My last couple of questions to you before we wind up. You know, can you just tell us or give some understanding regarding the current, under the current geopolitical situation that we are now, should the business community, be it in India or in Russia, prepare for a new geopolitical order where sanctions and trade war, that is a new normal?
We don't think it's normal. I don't think we'll ever call it normal. It's abnormal. And I think the world was a much better place when there were no sanctions, no geopolitical conflicts, and no trade wars. I think we all stand for liberal trading policies. Russia is not a long time ago joined WTO, actually, but opening our markets for the international trade, and I think that is very vital for the growth, for the global economic growth. And sanctions, that is absolutely illegal because sanctions could be only legal if they adopted by the United Nations.
Right.
But if one country using the instruments like dollar, for example, currency, for political reasons, there's no economic reason to this. They're not saying that if they take sanctions against any institution, they not because of the money laundering or any other, or not paying taxation or this kind of thing. That's because one country wants to achieve some political results. And of course, we can't accept it, so we will never call it normal.
Then how do we return to a global rule-based order for trading? Do you see any hope going forward?
Yeah, of course I will, of course, because you see how the world community is against it. And not only Russia, but look at the European Union, for example. The European Union started to think about strengthening the trade in Euro and creating their own mechanism, some kind of European SWIFT, because they're afraid of America. So I think there's a very big resistance on part of the global community, which for many, many years and decades was striving for liberal economic relationships. So I think the matter will be settled down one way or another. I think there will be new maybe agreements, but still, to a certain extent, I agree with you.
More protectionism, for example?
To a certain extent, I agree with you that the globalism is, at the moment, is not where it was maybe 5 years ago or even 3 years ago, and particularly Americans are doing this. But I think at the end of the day, the interest of the global economy, the interest of the hundreds of countries will prevail.
Right. Andrei Kostin, thank you for joining CNBC TV 18. That was Andrei Kostin, chairman of Russia-based VTB Bank. Still hopeful that perhaps we'll return to a rule-based trading order very soon. Thanks for watching CNBC TV 18.